My name is Bernard Ahern. I'm with the Health Action Network Society in British Columbia, and with me is Dr. John Lee, a practicing physician from Mill Valley, California. And Dr. Lee, you've been practicing medicine now for 30 years, and you were chairman of your Environmental Health Committee in Marin County, California. You were asked to look into the fluoridation issue. Was this the beginning of your inquiry into the fluoridation issue?
Yes. My original medical training was in Minnesota, and we were all taught that the question of fluoridation was resolved, that it was perfectly safe and effective. But the Medical Society at that time was asked to write a letter in support of a recent fluoridation referendum, and the president and the board of directors asked our committee to look into it, to review the original documents and the scientific basis for this, so that the letter they wrote would have some reality. And this was the first time that my eyes were opened to the fact that the scientific basis for fluoridation was very shakily established by naive and low-quality research done in the early 40s.
Okay, now just in talking about fluoride, first of all, is it true that fluoride is a major industrial pollutant, and it's toxic and has certain deleterious effects on the environment?
Oh, correct. If you review any of the biochemical literature, you'll find that the major source of all the fluoride in our environment comes as an industrial pollutant. In fact, in the States, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, lists fluoride in the top 5 of its industrial pollutants in the American environment. The actual source, of course, is in the fluoride mineral that's in the soil, where it's the 13th most common mineral. But in that place, it is perfectly safe. It is only when it is involved in aluminum production, phosphate fertilizer production, it becomes a waste product. And it's so toxic that these industries must find some way to get rid of it, or they would have to shut down operation.
So the fluoride compound that's put in the community water supply is really a waste product of industrial processes.
That's correct.
Now, what does the scientific literature show on the efficacy or the effectiveness of fluoridated water at, say, 1 part per million over an extended period of time? It's been used now for, what, 30 years in parts of the United States?
Right. 1 part per million means 1 milligram in every liter, approximately a quart, of water. And that was chosen because the study of the children growing up in the American Southwest were found to, in a study of the brown stain that occurred, it was found that these children also had an apparent resistance to decay. And when they compared cities, they found that this 1 milligram per liter seemed to be the optimal dose. Not too much fluorosis happened, and yet they seemed to be protected. The error that they made at that time was in assuming that it was the fluoride that did the protection. The fluoride causes the brown stain and the eventual destruction of the enamel. The benefit was due to the other minerals in these waters that came out of the Rocky Mountains. The calcium, the iron, the phosphorus, the magnesium, those were the good minerals. It was a tragic historical error when they added it to water that did not have these minerals, such as the water in New York City, or the water in Baltimore, or the water in San Francisco. There's been no benefit. Studies in the last 25 years are unable to show any benefit at all. The historical studies, the degree of benefit that they report was a short-term benefit in very young children. I have challenged the pro-fluoridationist authorities to find me a study of children 18 years old where the benefit persists. This is where the studies fall down.
Right. What does the scientific literature and the studies show about the any health problems, or in terms of the toxicity of fluoride? What is the
we were amazed to discover that the most prevailing reference offered by the pro-fluoridationists for the safety was the Bartlett-Cameron study in Texas. There they compared a town that had 8 parts per million from deep wells with another town that got their water primarily from rainwater runoff. It was less than, I believe, a half of a part per million. They did a study involving some simple tests done in 1 year and then repeated 10 years later on the same people. The simple tests were a routine urinalysis, a simple blood count, a sedimentation rate, which is entirely nonspecific, a syphilis test, and a back x-ray. Now, you have to realize cyanide would pass that test. Lead poisoning would pass that test. The interesting thing is that the people they examined 10 years later were in effect the survivors over this 10-year period. Their own data show that the death rate in the fluoridated town was 350% higher. In other words, 3.5 times more people died during that 10-year interval. Those people that died were dropped from the study. They were so naive, they were so enthusiastic for the concept of fluoridation, they could not bring themselves to believe that those deaths were important. In fact, we now find on much larger studies that the death rate is higher in fluoridated communities. We now understand the mechanism of action of the toxicity, and that is that fluoride is an enzyme deterrent. It inhibits enzyme activities. Enzymes are the basis of our life's metabolism. The National Academy of Sciences has a book called Fluorides, and in there, Chapter 6 is on the action of fluoride on biological mechanism, and it reports very clearly all of the enzymes that can be interfered with at 1 part per million or 2 part per million. You will get a 30% inhibition, a 60% inhibition, and as a result of that, people will become candidates for different illnesses, and it will differ from one person to another depending on their enzyme makeup, but it is all laid out. The National Academy of Sciences reports that enzymes should be regarded as a poison of oxidative metabolism. That's the biochemical mechanism by which we live.
Now this, there's been talk about the optimum amount of fluoride, even if it does work, and even if it were safe. Now this 1 part per million was set about 30 years ago?
1943, Dr. McClure, and I should say by Dr. McClure's study, on the comparison of a number of towns, he found that dental fluorosis would progressively rise when children received water with more than 1 milligram per liter. The apparent benefit that he observed, which as I say is from the other minerals, seemed to occur at about the 1 milligram of fluoride per liter level. Now, the difference is that in 1943, the water was primarily the only source of fluoride intake. The food itself that people eat in those unfluoridated times provided very little fluoride, less than 1/6 of a milligram per day. There were no toothpaste that had fluoride. There was no fluoride given to the children in vitamins and so on. So the water represented the main supply of the fluoride. 1 milligram per day they would get by drinking 1 liter of water, which is the average amount that a young child would drink. The difference is that today, in the late 1980s, there are now multiple sources of fluoride intake. The food is processed in fluoridated water. Soup that is made by a soup company uses fluoridated water. They sell the can of soup. The child drinks the soup, or the fruit juice that's been recombined with fluoridated water. He's getting fluoride. If he drinks a bottle of Coca-Cola made in a fluoridated community, he's getting fluoride. Also, all of the toothpaste that people buy, 1 to 2,000 parts per million, which means that 1 small ribbon of toothpaste for 1 toothpaste brushing will supply enough fluoride that that child will absorb a whole day's supply of fluoride from each brushing. If a child brushes his teeth 3 times a day, he is getting 3 days worth of fluoride, which is above and beyond all the fluoride he gets from the water. Even if the 1 milligram per day were correct, that amount is achieved several times over by the food and the toothpaste alone.
So many of us, children in particular, are being fluoridated without having to add it to the water
Of course. Tests have been done where they actually examine the fluoride in the enamel of unfluoridated children's teeth, and they find it is identical to the fluoridated children's teeth.
Right. Okay. Now, one of the big issues today, of course, is about the bones and osteoporosis, particularly in women. And I'm wondering if you can address the question of what is the wisdom or lack of it in prescribing fluoride tablets for women, particularly women over 30, and is there any other alternative for this problem with the bone and calcium loss?
Right. Having practiced in Mill Valley for approximately 30 years now, my patients have aged as I've aged, and osteoporosis is a very large part of my practice. I have done special investigation into this problem of osteoporosis, and particularly the question of whether fluoride would help. If fluoride would help, it would be a marvelous thing. The fact of the matter is that fluoride may induce more calcium of a sort to be added to bone density, but it is not true bone calcium in the sense that it is true bone structure. It is more like crystals of gravel that become mixed with your bone. Your bone may become slightly more dense on X-ray, but it does not become stronger. The complication is that the side effect rate is so high that it is essentially useless to use. I have a quote from Dr. Avioli, who is the Schoenberg Professor of Medicine at the Washington University School of Medicine, who is an international expert on this subject. He says that the increase of fracture rate was 10 times greater of the fluoridated people over the control group in the first year of the test. This was caused by an increased incidence of stress fractures. It also caused osteoarticular side effects in 47% of the fluoride-treated patients. It failed to decrease the hip fracture. Hip fracture is the major disorder that occurs in osteoporosis. It causes $4 to $6 billion worth of treatment care in the United States annually alone. In his opinion, it is not worth exploring as a therapy for postmenopausal osteoporosis. Now, some people bring up the question, does a little bit of fluoride in the water have a long-term effect in benefiting bones? I have a list of 7 references. Correction. I have a list of 9 references showing that this has been tested. It is not found. The best reference is a recent study by Dr. Sowers at Ohio, who compared the fracture rate among comparable groups of women in 3 towns that differed on calcium and fluoride content in their water. She found that the addition of fluoride to the water actually increased the fracture rate. There is no evidence that fluoridation benefits bones. The reason it doesn't is that these bone cells, the osteoblasts that make new bone continually to keep it strong, that bring the calcium and the minerals together to form this strengthened tissue, which we call bone, these cells themselves are inhibited by the toxic effect of fluoride.
Right, so what is the alternative that you recommend to your
Fortunately,
patients?
it has now been fairly well established that if we can continue the proper hormone supplementation after menopause, if we can continue the proper calcium intake, a little vitamin D, exercise, and the avoidance of those dietary elements that tend to be bad for bone, which are the artificially carbonated beverages. If we can do that, these bones not only resist osteoporosis, but it can be actually reversed, and the addition of progesterone is the key. Natural progesterone is a normal female hormone made by the ovary during all the time of a woman's menstrual life. It declines to a lower rate than estrogen does with menopause, and it is the key hormone in causing these bones to regain their normal activity for strength and for long life.
Right, how is this hormone taken, or how is it
Well, it's
applied?
interesting. The pharmaceutical companies have not bothered to produce a natural progesterone tablet. It has existed as an injection for many, many years, but that's a very expensive way. A fascinating fact about estrogen and progesterone hormones is that they are soluble and they will go through the skin, they can be absorbed through the skin. We have access to a cream, which is 3% progesterone in a very bland skin cream, and if it is applied, it has very excellent absorption through the skin itself, transdermal absorption. There are many medicines we now use in transdermal absorption. We use nitroglycerin, we have patches for treatment of hypertension, we have the scopolamine patches for the prevention of motion sickness. These are medicines that go through the skin and into the body. It in effect simulates what the ovary does. When the ovary made the hormones, it put it into the bloodstream. When you take progesterone by mouth, it will end up in the liver. Not much will get to the bones. If you take it through the skin, you will allow the body to receive it just as if the ovary made it. This natural progesterone cream, the one I use, is called Cielo, and it's made by Protec company in Portland, Oregon. It's very inexpensive, and the efficacy of it can be tested by using the dual photon bone density testing device. This does not use X-ray, it is not expensive, it is a very accurate measurement of the mineral content of bone. And using this process over the last 6 years, I have been able to show that people with very low bone mineral density, people with bad osteoporosis, will improve 5%, 10% or more per year. I have people who have improved now over 40%. They are back to where their bones were when they were 40 or 45 years old, and these people are 70, 75 years old. They now have a strong skeleton again. Osteoporosis is a preventable disease, and by the use of the hormones and the proper mineral and vitamins and the exercise, and it is also treatable. It is reversible, and this fact is seems to be a subject that other parts of the medical profession seem to be blind to.
Right. Now, this method of testing the bone, in your opinion, is superior to X-ray.
X-ray. We are told that even the best radiologist cannot detect any significant change of bone mineral density until 30% is lost. He then, by X-ray, can say this person has lost bone mineral. There is another test called a CT scan, and this test can be modified so that it can also accurately measure bone. It uses much higher doses of radiation. It uses X-ray radiation. It is much more expensive. The dual photon bone density is non-ionizing, that there's no damage to it. It is very reliable, it is repeatable, it is sensitive, and it is inexpensive.
Just on the, in wrapping up on the general question of, we call it the politics of fluoridation, you've referred in your discussions to a couple of examples in the San Francisco area. One was a woman lawyer, member of your board or city council, equivalent of your city council, and what happened when she inquired into the, or asked for some kind of reevaluation of fluoridation. I think it's been going on for 25 years.
Right. This is an example of Wendy Nelder. She is a supervisor, as you say, equivalent to city council member. She had looked into this question and had come to the conclusion that perhaps it was time to reevaluate the question of fluoridation. Actually, been 28 years or so that San Francisco had been fluoridated. She was aware that there were a lot of new scientific discoveries. She felt that it would be wise for the Board of Health or the Board of Supervisors to reevaluate this. For this, she was highly criticized by the local press. The Board of Supervisors, instead of adopting her sensible suggestion, told her that it would be much better for her to merely talk to a few experts, and they could straighten her out so that she wouldn't put up such a silly idea. And she did this. She took their advice. She had her, the San Francisco health officer, find 2 qualified experts, one being the president of the San Francisco Dental Society and one being the retired dean of the School of Public Health, where this fluoridation is taught. They came to her office. She also asked me to come over and sit in. It was amazing to me. I didn't do anything. She, with her sensible questions, merely asked the dentist if he knew what was the fate of the fluoride, what was the biological effect after it passed the teeth. She didn't argue about the teeth. She said, what happens when you give the fluoride and it goes to the rest of the body? He said, Wendy, that's not in my field. I don't know that. But I'm told that it's safe. She said, how can you be an expert brought here to tell me that it's safe when you're now saying you don't know? And he said, well, you have to take some things on faith. And she says, I do take things on faith. The things I take on faith is the process of inquiry that we are trained to do as a lawyer and in court. We are making the inquiry. You have no evidence. Thank you for coming. Let's go on to Dr. Winkelstein, the past dean of the public health school. Dr. Winkelstein brought up the example of the Kingston-Newburgh study. It was his understanding that Newburgh, the fluoridated city, was so much superior in the dental effects that Kingston fluoridated after just 4 years of test. The actual fact is that unbiased studies by dentists of the state of New York have shown there's no significant difference. There's an actual minor increase of dental decay in the fluoridated community. Kingston, the unfluoridated town then, is still unfluoridated. A recent study conducted by Dr. Axelrod in the state of New York shows that to this day there are more dentists and more dental costs in Newburgh, the fluoridated city. Kingston is not fluoridated and has the better teeth. Dr. Winkelstein was giving information that was demonstrably false. When this was presented to him, he said he didn't really know the facts. He said he was not lying. He just really didn't know very much about it. So Wendy Nelder turned to Dr. Silverman, the chief health officer and said, "Thank you very much for bringing these two fine gentlemen." They have both admitted they know nothing.
Well, the city, was it Kingston that was not fluoridated? They assumed had been fluoridated.
Yes,
Isn't that true?
that was what
Yeah.
he was telling Wendy Nelder.
Right, so it's another example of faith that they should have, but they actually had faith in something that didn't actually exist.
Didn't actually exist.
Right. What about your former Governor Brrown? He asked some questions apparently one time about the studies, the vaunted studies that show the benefits of fluoridation.
That was interesting also. There was a time when the states were wanting to pass a bill allowing the Department of Public Health to fluoridate any town without a vote of the people. This happened in Minnesota, for instance. It was attempted in Hawaii. It was attempted in Maryland, as I understand it. And it was attempted in California. And when that happened, Governor Brrown asked his chief health officer to hold some studies. I was invited to these. And Governor Brrown dropped in on the studies just as the chief authority for fluoridation was saying how it was so established. They had hundreds of studies showing that it was safe and effective. And he said, "I'd like to see one of those actual studies. I would like to know the scientific underpinning of this claim of yours." They couldn't come up with one. The commission folded in chaos, and nothing was happened. And in California, the bill was not pursued.
Right, now you've been studying this issue, I understand, Dr. Lee, for about 16 years.
Since 1972.
And you've reviewed the literature, you've been accepted as an expert witness in courts, and you've been in communication with other experts and other people involved. Now, is this a case of the emperor having no clothes? Is this really a myth that we've come, or a mindset, if you've described it, that are you in fact urging communities to reevaluate this now? And
absolutely. I do not regard myself as a dyed-in-the-wool anti-fluoridationist. I see myself as someone who was asked to go see the King's new clothes and found that they actually don't exist. I want the people to look for themselves. I want them to resolve the question themselves. Let them choose their expert. Let them actually look at the evidence. And it is my belief that they will all find that fluoridation is an unwise public policy.
Right. You've just come up from your busy practice in California. You've met with the caucus of the government party of British Columbia. Now you're on to Montreal to talk to some people and help them resolve this issue back there.
Yes, that's it. I certainly don't do this for a living. But I feel I have an obligation, having spent all these thousands of hours in trying to find the truth. I'm willing to come and offer my services to people who are also searching. The occasion that arose in British Columbia was that their own provincial dental health officer, Dr. Gray, reports doing studies where he finds that the best teeth in the children of Canada are in the unfluoridated areas. This fits exactly with the scientific pattern that I have found. And I think it's very good of Dr. Gray to have done this, and I think it's time for Canada to reevaluate its.
Right.